Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
Today we are talking about a piece of, I guess you would call it historical true crime, that reads like a telenovela. We're also going to hit the 200-year anniversary of this particular drama, which involves a politician, a lawyer, and a woman, perhaps connected to both of them. And it unfolds as a story of sexual scandal and political intrigue, and ultimately leads to murder. The details of the Beauchamp-Sharpe tragedy cannot all be verified. There remain a lot of questions regarding accusations made among the three and beyond, and even questions about testimony in a subsequent court case. So, a note on pronunciation. The way Beauchamp is spelled looks French. It looks like it would be pronounced Beauchamp. It is Beauchamp. I have heard it pronounced Beauchamp, but in a version of the story that was told in audio format by the Kentucky Historical Society, they use the pronunciation Beauchamp. It sort of pains me to shorten a beautiful French name in that way, but we're going to do it. That's my own bias. I couldn't find a definitive source for that pronunciation, but I'm going to presume that the Kentucky Historical Society has more knowledge of it, and so I'm happy to defer to them. This also made typing the name very difficult for me.
Oh, sure. I hear that pronunciation a lot, like among English speakers specifically for Beauchamp, when it looks like it should be Beauchamp.
Oh, I want it to be Beauchamp. Again, my own bias. But that is the story that we are going to tell today. To set the scene, we will start with a very brief biography of each of the three main players in the story.
So first main player in the story, Solomon P. Sharpe, who was born on August 22nd, 1787 in Washington County, Virginia. He grew up in a log cabin in Kentucky after his parents, Thomas and Jean Sharpe, moved there a few years after Solomon was born. This was a time when this area was still pretty rugged. Life was challenging there.
By the time he was 20, Solomon was already a practicing lawyer. He started his career as a lawyer in Russellville, Kentucky, but he soon moved about 26 miles east to Bowling Green, Kentucky. That's in Warren County. He quickly built a successful law career there, and he further grew his fortune by investing in land speculation. In 1809, he was elected to the state legislature as a county representative. He was reelected the next year.
His legislative career was interrupted by the War of 1812. Sharpe served in the Kentucky Mounted Militia, but that service was brief. He only served for 6 weeks, and then he went right back to politics and was elected to Congress in late 1812. He was a 2-term congressman, and then he went back to his law practice in Bowling Green.
In 1818, Sharpe married a woman named Eliza Scott. Eliza was from a very good family. She's sometimes described as like a debutante. And this was considered a very advantageous marriage for Sharpe. He had accomplished a great deal already by what was then his early 30s. He owned a lot of land. He was an enslaver. He owned a lot of people. And he had a pretty impressive legal and political career. But marrying Eliza gave him connections to society.
The next major player in this story was Anne Cook. Her name is spelled a number of ways depending on the source. Sometimes it's just A-N-N, other times Anne with an E on the end, or even Anna ending in an A. Her exact date of birth is not known. She was born in Virginia sometime in the mid-1780s. Estimates put it around 1786. Her parents were Giles and Alicia Cook. Anne was their first daughter. They already had 4 sons when she was born, and they had at least 1 additional son and daughter after. Giles died in the early 1800s, and at that point, Alicia moved, along with Anne and her siblings, to Warren County, Kentucky. By that point, some of Anne's brothers were adults. They had their own young families. They all moved together. The reason the whole family moved to Warren County was that Giles had also been a land speculator, and he had purchased a lavish estate property complete with an enslaved workforce in Kentucky before his death. So the whole family moved there.
The third person in this story is Jeroboam Beauchamp. He was born to a Kentucky farm family in September 1802, so he was the youngest of the three people involved here by more than a decade. Though his father, Thomas Beauchamp, was a farmer, Jeroboam had relatives in politics, and he started studying law in 1820.
Sometime in the 18 teens in Bowling Green, Anne crossed paths with Colonel Sharpe. Anne's life had included a lot of tragedy in the years after she moved to Kentucky. While things had initially gone pretty well, 3 of her brothers had died in less than 3 years. And she met the Sharpes through some mutual acquaintances while those sad events were playing out. Apparently, she had some degree of friendship with Eliza Sharpe. She visited her at home on several occasions.
Anne got pregnant in the autumn of 1819. She gave birth in May or June of 1820. That baby is usually reported as having been stillborn, although there are some accounts that suggest that it died shortly after it was born. At the time, Anne, who was unmarried and not romantically tied to anyone, claimed that the father was Solomon Sharpe. Anne did not really follow up on this claim, though, or seek any acknowledgement of it on Sharpe's part.
In June of 1821, Colonel Sharpe decided to run for public office again. This time he was running for a state Senate seat. And his political opponents chose to bring up this allegation that Cook had raised in an effort to discredit him. He was also accused of land fraud during the campaign. These 2 accusations were often bundled together in criticism of Sharpe. But then, fate intervened and seemed to offer a way for Sharpe to sidestep all of this. He was offered the state attorney general position by Governor John Adair, after the governor's first choice for that role declined. That, though, meant that Sharpe had to go through confirmation, and of course, these same accusations again came up during that confirmation. But after a Senate committee investigation, they found no wrongdoing, and Sharpe was confirmed as Attorney General.
Meanwhile, in 1821, Jeroboam Beauchamp finished his law degree and moved home to his father's house for a little break while he prepared for the bar. And he soon met a nearby neighbor. That was Anne Cook, who had moved to the rural area with her mother. Anne and Jeroboam started a courtship, and soon Jeroboam proposed. The pair waited until he passed the state bar exam in 1823 to move forward with their wedding plans. In 1824, they were married. Jeroboam moved to the farmhouse that Anne shared with her mother.
We'll pause here for a sponsor break, and when we come back, we'll talk about how all of this unraveled.
So at the point we left off before the break, it kind of seemed like everyone's lives were pretty settled. Sharpe had his attorney general position, and the newlywed Beauchamps were starting their life together. But then Sharpe decided he wanted to run for a state legislator position in 1825. There is a whole story about how and why that decision was made, and we're going to give a super abbreviated version of it because this whole affair could be its own episode as well. It involves a lot of political arguing about legislation that had been passed as part of a relief effort to help farmers in the state of Kentucky who had faced economic hardship and potential foreclosures, and then that legislation was rejected on a legal appeal. Following that failed appeal, the sitting judges were all dismissed by the Kentucky General Assembly, and an entirely new court was appointed. At that point, lawmakers of Kentucky split pretty hard into 2 factions, the so-called Old Court Party and the New Court Party. Sharpe was a member of the New Court Party.
Sharpe had been right in the middle of that conflict, and he thought he could support his position better as a legislator than as an attorney general. That position had been kind of a straddling of the fence on this issue. Once he entered the race, though, the allegations about his relationship with Anne Cook and the paternity of her child surfaced again. Sharpe vehemently denied these allegations. as he had when they circulated previously.
Soon after these allegations came back up, a counter rumor began to spread that the deceased child had been of mixed race, suggesting that it could not possibly have been Sharpe's, and also insinuating that Anne had a sexual relationship with a black man. It was believed, though denied, that Sharpe's camp had started that rumor regarding Anne's baby's race, though there were also claims that her midwife had provided the Sharpe family with a sworn document backing that rumor. But despite all of this gossip and mudslinging, Solomon Sharpe won his election.
The day the Legislative Assembly was to begin, November 7th, 1825, Solomon Sharpe and his wife Eliza were awakened at approximately 2 a.m. by somebody knocking at their door. They were claiming to be somebody that the couple knew who was in need of lodging. When questioned through the door, this person said that all the local taverns were full and that he needed a bed for the night. Here is how things played out from there. According to the paper, the Frankfurt Argus, quote, Colonel Sharpe told him he should have a bed and opened the door. The assassin entered and passed with Colonel Sharpe by the door of Mrs. Sharpe's room. He then asked, "Are you Colonel Sharpe?" The colonel answered in the affirmative. The assassin then said, "My name is John A. Covington." Colonel Sharpe replied, "I do not know you." The assassin said, "Damn you, you shall soon know me," and plunged the fatal weapon into his body.
Colonel Sharpe groaned and fell to the ground, and when Eliza heard that, she jumped out of bed and ran to him. Sharpe's brother Leander, who also lived in the home, heard the noise as well and ran to see what it was. Sharpe died from his stab wound just a few minutes after the attack without saying a word to his wife or brother. The only clue left at the scene was a bloody handkerchief. It was believed that it had been used first to conceal the knife and then to wipe the blade after the stabbing. The assailant had run out through the same door that he entered, with neither of Sharpe's surviving relatives having seen any detail of his face. They could only report that it had been a tall man wearing dark clothes.
A manhunt began immediately, and the trustees of Frankfurt put up a $1,000 reward, quote, for the purpose of apprehending the monster who committed this diabolical act. In addition to that, the state governor, with an authorization from the state legislature, offered another $3,000, quote, for the apprehension of the murderer of Colonel Sharpe. Although Sharpe had just been part of a very polarized election cycle at a time when Kentucky was very much divided, the community galvanized over his murder, and even his most intense rivals and detractors condemned the murder and called for justice.
While suspicion had briefly fallen on one of Sharpe's political rivals, eventually Beauchamp was the person who came into focus. He was known to have been in Frankfurt the night before the murder. He had apparently left the lodgings where he was staying in the middle of the night, and then he had left the following morning. News of the attack had already broken when he left, and while everyone else in town was aghast and discussing Sharpe's death, Beauchamp was disinterested to the point that people thought it was odd. Additionally, he had threatened Sharpe on several occasions when rumors about his seduction of Anne had circulated. As citizens of the area pieced these bits of information together, a group formed up and went to his and Anne's farm in the next county to apprehend him. He was brought back to Frankfurt on November 15th and formally arrested once he arrived there.
There was plenty of testimony at the ready regarding Jeroboam Beauchamp, but physical evidence was a lot harder to come by. He did have a knife when he was taken in, but that knife could not be conclusively tied to the murder. The knife wound on Sharpe's body was a lot wider than the blade of Beauchamp's knife. Furthermore, it was not the least bit odd at this time and place for a man to be carrying a knife. The handkerchief that had been found at the scene had been picked up by the posse that followed Beauchamp home, but then it had been lost on the journey. So the strongest piece of evidence against Beauchamp was Eliza Sharpe, who identified his voice as that of the attacker.
But Beauchamp declared his innocence from the moment he was taken in. He was adamant that he had never threatened Sharpe, and he wrote to a number of people hoping for help in the matter. One of those people has come up on the show before. That was lawyer and politician George M. Bibb, whose family we covered in July of 2022. Beauchamp told Bibb, who had been a close friend of Sharpe's, that he was being framed.
I have penciled that Bibb episode in as a Saturday classic, forthcoming for people who are interested. That might sound far-fetched. Not the Saturday classic, what Holly just said.
Tracy, really?
But there were people who believed it, and with pretty good reason. In the middle of all the tumult that had been going on in Kentucky politics, there had been instances of violence, like basically fisticuffs. And some of Sharpe's friends and allies in the legislature thought it was possible that his political enemies could have taken things farther in an effort to eradicate a powerful opponent to their agendas. One of Sharpe's friends, named Amos Kendall, who would eventually become Postmaster General of the United States, ran the Argus of Western America, and he used his platform to accuse Sharpe's rivals of goading Beauchamp on by making sure those rumors about Sharpe and Anne stayed circulating. He even accused specific politicians of going directly to Beauchamp to talk about these rumors. There were implications that some of these men had been near Sharpe's house in the early morning of November 7th, insinuating that they had urged Beauchamp to take action.
We are going to get to Beauchamp's trial, but before we do, we will hear from the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History class going. During the grand jury hearing, which found cause to move forward with a trial, but not enough evidence to suggest that anyone other than Beauchamp be charged, Jeroboam's attorney, John Pope, asked if they could postpone the trial for a while so they would have time to put together their case. That was honored, and this trial was set for May the following year. When it began on May 8th, 1826, Jeroboam Beauchamp pled not guilty.
During the trial, which was prosecuted by Charles Bibb, just to keep the Bibb family in the mix, one of the interesting pieces of testimony came from Patrick H. Darby. Darby was one of the men who had been accused of stirring up Jeroboam and inciting him to murder. His testimony indicated that he had met with Beauchamp, but that he hadn't known who the defendant was when they met. Darby claimed that while the two men both happened to have stopped at the same roadside well while traveling, Beauchamp broached the subject of the purported sexual relationship between Sharpe and Anne. Anne told Darby that Sharpe had basically offered him a bribe, with that being money, an enslaved girl, and property, if they would just drop it and leave him alone. But he had never delivered on the promised items, and Jeroboam was hoping to enlist Darby to help him get what he was owed. Darby testified that he refused to do this, and that at that point, Beauchamp said he would kill Colonel Sharpe. In cross-examination, defense attorney Pope pointed out that Beauchamp's conviction would help Darby and his political allies get out of hot water, so his testimony should be considered questionable. Darby also brought another witness into the case. That was Anne and Jeroboam's neighbor named Lowe. The neighbor stated that when Jeroboam had returned to his farm from Frankfort, he had been waving a red flag and claiming victory, but he had not discussed with the defendant what that actually meant. Lowe also stated that he had letters from Beauchamp that incriminated him. These letters were not missives that included a plan to murder Sharpe. They had been written after Beauchamp was arrested. They were incriminating because they included detailed directives on the story that Jeroboam would like Lowe to tell in court, including that Anne had not been the one to introduce the rumor of the affair with Sharpe, but that it had been concocted by one of his political rivals, John Waring.
Yeah, Pope really tried to have this letter struck, and it did not hold up because it obviously made the defendant look very bad. Throughout this trial, which went on for 2 weeks, every aspect of the case was, of course, addressed and debated in detail. Witness testimony, though, was largely contradictory, with just about anything introduced by the prosecution countered with an opposite account from a defense witness. Everything from the issue of the size of the knife to the disappearing bloody handkerchief was discussed. And there, too, in those pieces of physical evidence or lack thereof, the expert testimony from each side contradicted the other. There was no physical evidence of the actual crime. It was all circumstantial. And the only sticking point remained Eliza Sharpe's insistence that Jeroboam's voice was the one she had heard at their door the night her husband was murdered. This case went to the jury at 5 p.m. on Friday, May 19th. At about 6 p.m., just an hour later, the verdict was read. Guilty.
For a while, it seemed like Anne might also be charged. Their neighbor, Lo, had more to say about this. This was actually precipitated by Jeroboam's defense counsel, who introduced the possibility of Anne being a more active participant as a way to postpone the sentencing. Lo told the judges that Anne had told him that she had helped plan this murder, and she detailed the various ways that they had gone about learning the layout of the Sharpe home, acquiring shoes and a knife that were different from her husband's personal items, things like that. Lo also told the judges that Darby's testimony about a bribe to silence the Beauchamps was not correct and that no such deal had ever been offered. But although this was compelling and a dramatic development, it was determined that Anne had not been materially responsible for the murder, so she was not charged. That same day, Jeroboam was sentenced to death.
Yes, so much of this trial hung on the testimony of their neighbor Lo, who was a person that Darby had found and said, "I think you know about this case." It's also convoluted and dramatic and a lot of machinations.
So much of it, I'm like, this seems like hearsay to me.
Uh-huh. The date of the execution was set for June 16th, but Beauchamp asked for a postponement because he wanted to write something. Surprisingly, this request was honored, and the new date of execution was set for July 7th. Jeroboam returned to his cell to write, and his wife Anne joined him. She stayed with him throughout the rest of his life. While an appeal was attempted, it did not gain traction.
And this is where Beauchamp's story seems to have just changed abruptly, almost from the moment that he was sentenced. People started reporting that he was telling people that he had, in fact, been the murderer. This information was relayed to the press, which just ran with it. Simultaneously, he started to write the thing that he had in mind, which opens as follows, quote, "I am this day condemned to die by my country's laws. My country has extended the limited time first fixed for my existence on earth in order that I might write an account of the causes which have led to my death."
He goes on to confess in this document, but also to justify his actions in doing so. Quote, "I die for pursuing what the dictates of my clearest and most deliberate judgment had determined it was at least justifiable in me to do, if not my duty to do, and for which no guilty pang of conscience has ever yet reproved me, or the certain prospect of death made me feel the least regret. And if my death teaches a respect for the laws of my country, my example will be not less serviceable in teaching a respect for those laws of honor, to revenge the violation and outrage of which I so freely die."
The writing indicates that Jeroboam intended for there to be a didactic outcome from the murder and the trial. Writing, quote, "The death of Colonel Sharpe at my hands will teach two lessons, not altogether uncalled for by the present moral and political state of society in Kentucky. It will teach a certain class of heroes who make their glory to consist in triumphs over the virtue and the happiness of worthy, unfortunate orphan females to pause sometimes in their mad career and reflect that though the deluded victim of their villainy may have no father to protect or revenge her, yet some friendly arm may sooner or later be nerved by her to avenge her blighted prospects." The second lesson Beauchamp felt the colonel's death might impart was this, quote, "My example, or rather that of Colonel Sharpe's, will also teach the unprincipled politician in his career of ambition that if his dishonor has driven from society and buried in a living grave an unfortunate female who had fallen a victim to his villainy, It may be better to lie under the reproach of her seduction than to hazard adding further insult to so deep an injury, slander, and detraction to such an outrage upon every human feeling.
One aspect of Beauchamp's sentence that fascinated the public at the time, and frankly, a lot of people since, was that Anne made no secret that she wished to have the same fate as her husband. Jeroboam also wrote about this in his confession, noting, quote, "My wife is, I know, inflexible in her determination, that as I die for her, she will die with me. I have no motive to conceal the part which she has acted, the more especially as she insists to let the world know all the agency she has had in bringing about a revenge for the deep, indelible wrong which Colonel Sharpe had done her and her family."
On July 5th, Anne administered what she thought would be a fatal dose of laudanum to both herself and to Jeroboam. She had snuck the laudanum into the cell, concealing it in her clothing. It was not a fatal dose, and she and Jeroboam were both put on suicide watch, but it doesn't appear that anybody searched her at that time because she still had more laudanum with her. She took that, but rather than killing her, it just caused her to vomit.
2 days later, on the 7th, which was the date that Jeroboam was to be executed, the pair asked for some time alone. They were not supposed to be left unattended, but for some reason the jailer agreed. Anne, still determined that they should die together, and once again with contraband in her possession that no one had managed to notice, pulled out a knife and stabbed herself in the chest. She also convinced Jeroboam to stab himself. He stabbed the knife into his abdomen, but apparently did not hit any vital organs. His wound was not fatal, and hers was. She died an hour after the stabbing with her husband by her side. She had been removed from the cell, but they allowed him to come to where they had her when they realized she was about to expire. He reportedly stated as he watched her pass, quote, "I wish Dr. Sharpe was here. I wish he was here to behold this spectacle." Her last words, as reported in the local newspaper, were, "Oh, my husband, I die for my husband."
Beauchamp was taken to the gallows in the early afternoon. He was composed. He asked for some water and for the attending band to play Bonaparte's Retreat from Moscow, and then he was hanged.
After the execution, newspapers ran the story with an introductory paragraph that read, quote, "The tragic scene has closed, and the curtain has fallen over the murderer of Colonel Solomon P. Sharpe. The trial, conviction, and confession of guilt and execution of Jeroboam O. Beauchamp for the murder and suicide of Anne Beauchamp, formerly Anne Cook, who was privy to and instigated her husband to the murder of Sharpe."
It was also after the execution that Jeroboam's confession became public. In writing it, it appears that he was hoping the contents would lead to his sentence being commuted or even that he might be pardoned. He did not claim innocence in the murder, but he invoked Darby's involvement. And this confession also had some bombshells. A big one was that he said he had heard about the rumors regarding Sharpe and Cook and had subsequently orchestrated a way to meet her. Shortly after they had become acquainted, he said he had confronted Sharpe about it, but that Sharpe had gotten away from him, and that this had happened 4 years before the murder. And then he described how his desire to kill Sharpe was a big part of the bond that he shared with Anne. He wrote that at one point he and Anne tried to lure Sharpe to their house with a fake lead on a land claim, hoping that they could kill him there. But Sharpe didn't come. What emerges is a tale of two people deeply intent on getting revenge.
Yeah, his version of why they didn't get married until 1824 was that initially Anne told him he had to kill Sharpe before she would marry him. Like, there's a whole wild what their relationship really was that plays out in this confession. But another version of the events was written down by Colonel Sharpe's brother, Dr. Leander Sharpe. This was titled Vindication of the Character of the Late Colonel Solomon P. Sharpe. And the Leander account, actually, like the other, does place the blame on Darby's shoulders. It strongly suggests that he was actually the one that started the rumors of Sharpe and Ann Cook's affair, and it also reiterates the story that her deceased child had been of mixed race. One of the things that does give Leander Sharpe's account a bit more weight in the eyes of many historians is the fact that he worked pretty diligently to collect evidence. He collected accounts from various witnesses, he gained sworn testimonies, he actually ran down a lot of leads, and he included all of this in his work. But this version of events was suppressed due to pressure from Darby, and it only came to light decades later when the manuscript was found in the Sharpe home.
Yet another publication did see public release in 1826, and it was The Letters of Ann Cook. This salacious collection of missives was popular with a public that wanted to condemn the behavior of everyone involved in this tragedy, but also wanted to learn all of the juicy details in private. This publication was almost certainly a fake, not real letters Anne had written, although it has been referenced a lot of times by people as though it were legitimate in the last 2 centuries.
As noted in the book Murder and Madness, The Myth of the Kentucky Tragedy, which was written by Matthew Schoenbachler in 2009, quote, most of what we do know about the Kentucky tragedy comes from 3 remarkable documents: the published proceedings of Beauchamp's murder trial, Beauchamp's confession, and a vindication of Solomon Sharpe written by his devoted brother, Dr. Leander Sharpe. Since the Sharpe and Beauchamp writings contradict each other and the trial account likely contains testimony that was purposely false, we're kind of left to puzzle out for ourselves whether this was truly a crime of honor-bound vengeance or just the result of political machinations.
In 1967, the Kentucky Historical Society had a marker placed at the grave of Jeroboam and Anne, which takes a pretty starry-eyed stance. The front of that marker reads, Romantic 1825 Tragedy, Jeroboam Beauchamp and his wife Anna buried here in same coffin at own request. To avenge her alleged seduction by Colonel Solomon Sharpe, Beauchamp murdered him at Sharpe's Frankfort home, 1825. Beauchamp and Anna were held in Frankfort jail. She was released but joined her husband in his cell, refusing to be separated even by force. He was sentenced to hang. The back of the marker reads, quote, on execution day, they attempted suicide by stabbing themselves. Her wound was fatal, but he lived to be hanged that day, the first legal hanging in Kentucky, 1826. Colonel Sharpe's political prominence caused case to have widespread newspaper publicity. Edgar Allan Poe and many other authors wrote of the tragedy, inspired by Beauchamp's deep devotion and love.
It's such a romanticized version. Fascination with this case does seem to be never-ending. Fiction has, as referenced in that marker, drawn from it many times. Social and legal analysts have continued to break down the details of the case and examine it through various lenses over the years. One of the angles that I didn't see considered or talked about very often was put forth by Dickson D. Bruce Jr. in his 2000 book, The Kentucky Tragedy, A Story of Conflict and Change in Antebellum America. In the book, Bruce notes the cultural context of Beauchamp's crime. Quote, Kentucky could be a violent place in the 1820s. It was a place where people gave credence to a strict and bloody code of honor that, among other things, provided little room for despoiling a woman's character, as Sharpe is said to have done, and virtually demanded the kind of violent retribution Beauchamp exacted. Thus, to a great extent, the code served to frame how people understood the Beauchamp-Sharpe affair at the time and how they have continued to interpret its significance. Bruce also notes, as others have, that it's impossible to find any contemporary writings about the events involved that isn't biased. So the only truths that we can really hang on to are the few components that are consistent from account to account. Oh, we got a whole thing to talk about on Friday.
We sure do.
About poems.
Okay. Do you have listener mail?
I do. We have gotten a lot of emails about our Library of Congress episode, and I want to read them all because they're really good, but I really wanted to read this one in the hopes of wishing someone the best possible good fortune going forward. This is from our listener, Katie, who says, hello, Holly and Tracy. Longtime listener, first-time emailer. I'm writing to thank you for your episode on the Library of Congress and your acknowledgement of the unjust firing of Dr. Carla Hayden. I have been a librarian with the federal government for over 11 years, and the last 4 months have been some of the hardest in my career. Sadly, I know I'm not unique in this regard. I have always appreciated your references to and use of various libraries and the vast resources they provide. Libraries of all types have always faced challenges: shrinking budgets, book bans, finding ways to provide equitable access to all citizens, be it books, maker spaces, access to free Wi-Fi, or a place to stay warm or cool. This is our passion and our calling, and as with many helping professions, we are not in it for the money. As we face so much uncertainty in the world, libraries have always been a safe space, and I hope we survive the next 4 years. Thank you for all that you do. I'm obviously crying because I hope so too. But then Katie attaches pictures of her kitty, Blue, as a pet tax. Blue is a fluffy, gray, magical creature. Very near and dear to my heart is a gray cat. So I love these. Thank you for sharing them. I'm sorry I'm getting so choked up. I really want libraries to survive and thrive. That's all. I'm wishing you well. If you would like to write to us and make me cry, you can do that at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can also subscribe on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.